African food crisis has gotten to its lowest point owing to climate change, wars, and wait for this, locusts. This has actually been the bane of some of the crises that the continent is dealing with at the moment. And one good thing about it all is that we're looking at how Africa can get out of a food crisis, an impending one, that is. And hey, wait a minute. That's the kind of rush you hear when people truly are angry and hungry. Welcome to VSA. I'm Sulaiman. Africa is currently battling its worst food crisis since 1945, and of course, millions could die in the coming month. Malnourished and poorly fed children are the biggest victims of the crisis. Climate change, regional conflict, and population growth have been pinpointed as major causes of the devastating crisis. There's no doubt that Africa needs food, but how it will be provided has become one of the biggest problems ravaging the continent. While crops have failed to yield amid drought, animals are dying in the famine owing to lack of food and water, leaving many Africans with practically nothing to feed on. In East Africa, for instance, water deficit, a heavy locust infestation, and plant diseases have been debilitating factors on food production. In countries like South Sudan, the aftermath of war is still stifling citizens as starvation sticks around. Ethiopia is facing its worst battle against locust in 25 years, and Kenya farmers and herders have not seen anything like it in 70 years, as you can see. Now, in West Africa, a food crisis is looming, no thanks to the harsh weather, while northeast Nigeria has been hit with the bitter side of a war against terrorism that has lasted over a decade in the region. Southern Africa is also battling a creeping food crisis, with countries like Malawi, Zambia, Zimbabwe being the worst affected. So the region is facing its worst drought in 35 years, and currently about 60% of Zimbabwe's population faces starvation. That's the point for the Square today. Dr. Tim Njagi, Senior Research Fellow, Tegemeo Institute of Research and Policy, Egerton University, Kenya, and Gerald Masila, Executive Director, Eastern Africa Grain Council. Gentlemen, welcome to Village Square Africa. Now, quickly, because we really mustn't, allow anyone go hungry. Worst food crisis in the continent in 70 years. That's what we're dealing with. A human-mediated crisis also on the plate, as well as natural affliction or a combination of both. How did we get here? Starting with you, Masila.
Thank you very much for having me in your program and for taking this very important topic. I do agree with you that Africa is facing quite a serious food security issue because of the fact that, first of all, our production systems are mainly subsistence, and therefore we just don't produce sufficiently. We are not deploying technology sufficiently, whether it is seed technology or irrigation or mechanization at farm level. We are not doing that sufficiently. Then we are also not preserving our food after the good years that we get good harvests. We don't preserve this food, we don't store it well, and so it gets lost post-harvest pretty quickly. And lastly, the fact that we don't have good trade, structured trade flows of our food from one country to another, from one region to another, I would say those three are the key factors that have driven us to where we are today. Thank you.
Okay, we're trying to establish this now. Let me go to Tim Njagi. Perhaps, the question we'll be asking, how did we get here? Do you have anything contrary to what Gerald has?
Thank you. Thank you for having us on the show. And I think our opinion would not necessarily differ from what Gerald has said. I think when you look at how our agriculture has progressed, I think it's important to say that although the natural factors have been important, but the human-led factors have also been important. Just again to stress, for most of the countries in Africa, we have really underinvested in agriculture to the point that now Gerald raises. So for us to attain food security, it's either that we produce enough or we have ways that allow trade to happen so that we can actually access what is being produced in other areas. So yeah, both a long history of underinvestment, which is a human aspect, and of course now Africa is also ravaged with a lot of natural shocks. You mentioned in the opening issue about the locust. We're also battling with the increased incidences of drought and famine, and also when it rains again, it floods. So those are some things that a bit we can do more in terms of mitigation, but clearly the human aspects are more than we really struggled on the human aspect parts, both in terms of policy, investments, and also the decisions that are being implemented to attain food security in Africa.
Gerald, the thing here is that once the problem was attributable to climate change. Is that still the case at the moment?
Yes, I would agree that climate change has contributed a lot to the current crisis. But when you interrogate that further, you will see that there is another underlying factor, and this is the selection of the enterprises, the various crops that we have been promoting, or people have been promoting in the last 30, 40 years. You will notice that most of these crops that have been promoted by donors, by other people, are generally foods that have been brought in from other regions, other ecosystems, and they are not very well suited to the African ecosystem, and are not actually even fitted to they don't fit to the climatic conditions. So when you also look at the kind of cropping that is taking place, there has been a lot of concentration on one kind of a crop. So like you would find maybe maize being over focused in so many of these jurisdictions, and maybe cassava and a few others. And therefore, we have over the last several years, maybe 40, 50 years, we have lost a lot of indigenous seeds, indigenous cultivars that were well suited, well fitted to climate change, to drought. And therefore, one of the major reasons why drought is hurting so much is that we are basically growing maize and more maize everywhere, including even places that are not well suited for maize production, where we should be promoting other kind of crops and cereals. But because there's been too much focus on project-minded kind of approach, and some of the donor activities that come and do some prioritization and say, because this is an important crop, let us invest in it, let us research it, and then everything else is forgotten. Then later on, they start telling you, there are orphan crops, and that one is an orphan one. And I always often ask, who was the parent that now they are being called orphans, and yet they've just lacked the kind of attention and focus for research, for promotion. So I would say that drought cannot be blamed a whole sort of wholesale, but we also have to see what are we planting in our farms, and where is the variety, because from the variety you are also able to do your risk mitigation by ensuring that what you are doing in your farmland has a scale, you have different types, and those that are also suited and they can take the beating when there is drought. Thank you very much.
Let me bring Tim in here, because you've actually raised an interesting perspective. But Tim, if you look at it over the years, Africa has evolved, from subsistence farming we have seen amongst family members to big time, agricultural, farming. And that is one of the reasons we have experts like yourselves with us today on the show. How have we been able to latch on to technology to help tweak, the process to make it a better subsistent, farming system for the people of the continent?
That's a very good point. And actually, one of the things that Africa has for its advantage is that most of these technologies we do not have to invent. In Europe, when they were undergoing through the agrarian revolution, they had to come up with the technology. In Asia, during the agrarian revolution, they also had again to come up with the technology. What remains as a key gap for Africa, what Gerald mentioned, the issue about adaptation, for example, is to see which technologies best work for us. And for us to be able to efficiently do this, we must significantly invest in research. Then, of course, the next thing also is to look at how did the other regions do it? How did Latin America do it? How did Europe do it? How did Asia do it? I like looking at Asia because they are more closer to us in terms of many things, including the agroecological environment, in terms of economic development as well. But when you look at and you try to disaggregate the Asian Green Revolution, you realize that they started with the technology. So they first of all found the varieties that were suited for the crops that they wanted to grow, and then they invested in the infrastructure, beginning with the production infrastructure, putting a lot of money in development of irrigation, and then following up now with the market infrastructure that was required to support that, including how to value addition and all that. I think for us, we need to learn and we need to see, as we think about technologies, yes, we've seen a lot of tremendous improvement in terms of access and availability of these technologies. In countries like you mentioned, East Africa, when you look at countries like Kenya, Uganda, Tanzania, Ethiopia, up to Rwanda, of course, one of the key challenges has been to getting these technologies to farmers. And the investment in the extension systems that allows farmers to access and interact and eventually make choices that raise productivity on their farms remains critical. So I would argue that yes, for Africa we need to invest more in development of technologies, adapting of these technologies, and also making sure that we can take these technologies to farmers and then provide farmers with a supporting infrastructure for them to be able to utilize these technologies.
We'll take a moment. When we'll come back, we'll speak more on the issue of technology and as well key in the genetically modified, kind of seedlings and produce we have also on the continent. That's when we return. Welcome to Village Square Africa, and today we're looking at the food crisis on the continent. Inconsistent or low rainfall have also not helped yields on the continent. Families are being forced to leave their homes in search of food, with others running away from terrorists. Now, the food crisis has led to food insecurity in the continent or the sub-Saharan region. In Somaliland, more than 2.2 million are at risk of hunger. More than 5.4 million people are without nutritious food, and more than 60,000 people have been displaced by drought. Coming up, West Africa, about 24 million people could go hungry between June and August of this year, except rapid steps are taken. And even in Nigeria's northeast region, 13 million people could be in hunger as a result of famine and terrorism that has stopped people from going to the farms. And that is why on VSA, we have brought in experts, from across the continent, Tim Njagi, and of course, Gerald Masila, to look at how we can get the continent out of this. Now, in South Sudan, for instance, in Somalia specifically, and Kenya, where you are, gentlemen, and Ethiopia, not less than 20 million people need food assistance. This hasn't always been the case. Now, let's see how we can expand this discussion, gentlemen. Technology, which we highlighted before we went on that break, is very key here. The extension workers come in focus here. How are they helping the small-time farmers in remote areas of the continent get in tune with what exactly we're trying to deal with at the moment? Gerald, if you can hear me, this is actually to you, looking at what exactly the extension workers have been doing on the continent. Do you think that the incursion they're making has actually been yielding the required results?
Thank you very much for the question. Now, the issue of extension, whether or not there is extension going on, I think has been a very contentious matter, because we all know that the structural adjustment processes that took place in the early 80s, early 90s, that brought in quite a lot of changes where extension was presented as something that should privatize, and there was a lot of reorganization, restructuring. Many of the state corporations and state agencies that were providing extension were disbanded in many parts of Africa, and the theory then was that government shouldn't be spending a lot of resources in providing agriculture extension, and that should be provided by private sector and so on and so forth. But we all know, and it has been documented, that all those structural adjustment programs then that were pushed by the World Bank, they all failed. What we don't know is whether anyone has ever taken responsibility for that misadvice to the African governments. And so what has been happening in the 30, 40 years, and even in the recent past, is that extension literally is non-existent. If you go to most governments and you go to the ministries of agriculture, they don't have extension staff. They have not actually been employing professionals in the agriculture space to provide advice, to provide extension to farmers. And the kind of extension that has been happening is basically people who sell various farm inputs, whether it is fertilizer or seeds or other chemicals or whatever it is, are the ones that reach out and essentially sell their solutions. So the kind of extension that is happening out there is a kind of salesmanship and not extension per se, where we should be having extension that is non-partisan, that is providing proper, genuine advice to farmers in the selection and of the crops, of the various things that they are doing. And so we would say that generally the talk about extension in Africa, to the experience we have, and for us at the EAGC, we are working in 10 countries in the Eastern Africa region. I can tell you extension is not there as what it was. And that's one of the reasons why agriculture is not doing well, because the investment, like Dr. Njagi said earlier on, investment in agriculture, even with signing the Malabo Declaration, even with all the commitments that have been put, investment in agriculture is still extremely low. And that is why we are not getting the results that we expect, because we don't invest in agriculture. I think it's not fair that we should expect results when we have invested.
When do you think Africa can be declared free from a food crisis, putting in context the activities of African leaders?
I think we've seen some steps, but I think we can do much better. I think it's only, for example, when you look at leading institutions in Africa, including the AU, I mean, we've tried to prioritize in terms of making these commitments. Unfortunately, nobody has called for accountability in terms of following up, with individual countries to see whether they're actually, doing what they committed to do. We've seen, again, initiatives including, for example, the Abuja Declaration, trying again to make sure that we promote, agriculture to be, at par with what other regions are doing. We've seen efforts, including the one that is led by the African Development Bank, to provide financing, for agriculture. But we still see a huge gap in terms of how individual countries are doing this. And again, just to emphasize that when you look at case-by-case studies, when you're comparing between what one country is doing and what another country is doing, you can actually see evidence of actually what works. And for this, I would want to look at the example of, for example, within the East African region, when you look at countries like Rwanda and Ethiopia, they are the two countries in the region that have experienced consistent growth in agricultural productivity over the last decade. And the key reason why this has happened for them is that they have invested more in the extension systems, getting the knowledge and know-how to their farmers compared to the other countries in the region.
So in other words, sorry to butt in here, in other words, the extension workers, if adequately, empowered, can give the continent some sort of result.
Significant improvement. There is actual evidence that points to that if we go that route, we can have significant improvement in productivity. And then, of course, the next thing that once we have that productivity, linking up to what Gerald said, we must make sure that we store it well. And then, make sure that it's available in the market where actually consumers can actually access it. So what we need to do is to kind of hold these commitments to the individual countries. And of course, the best place to do this would be starting with the African Union, where they can actually, lead in terms of holding countries accountable. Actually, we have around 54 countries, and by the last count we were checking, less than 10 had actually done the 10% investment in agriculture. So that tells you that commitment alone will not actually help. We have this year, I think we have another round of Abuja that will be coming in, where again countries will be expected to either recommit to the earlier commitment because we've never met them on the usage of fertilizer. But then just making these commitments alone is just a talk shop. We need to go beyond and try to hold countries and their leaders accountable to what they have committed to do.
Absolutely. We need to go beyond, having a talk shop and see pretty much action for experts like yourself. Let me bring in Gerald. You are also of the Eastern African Grain Council. Now, I'm trying to look at the yields that we have at the moment on the continent, specifically where you are at the moment. As an expert, what solutions do you think the continent should adopt amid this problem, especially as it relates to grains?
Thank you very much for that question. And it's a good question because you're asking about solutions.
Absolutely.
I think the first solution has to do with the topic we were just discussing, which is the role of extension and the investment in agriculture. And why I bring this in is because when you visit any typical farm in African setting, whether it's in East Africa or West Africa or wherever, you will realize that the decision of what someone will plant, what the farmer will plant in their farm, is a private decision. That's not a decision dictated by government or by any power. It is the person who owns the farm who decides that I will plant cassava, or I'll plant maize, or I'll plant beans. But what drives that decision is the information that that farmer has, the expectations they have in terms of what they expect they could get out of it, and most importantly, what they think they might get from the market. So connected to us empowering extension and investing in agriculture, the second thing that must happen, and this we are insisting even within the Africa Free Continental CFTA, is that we have to bring in interventions that will make sure that markets remunerate the farmers adequately. If the market does not pay the farmer so much so that they are able to get an income through selling their produce that meets their cost of production and gives them some bit of a margin so that they're in business, they're able to be there tomorrow, then we are going to have the problem will compound with time. And how to make the markets remunerative is to look at the value chains, analyze the value chains, look at the cost of production, and governments must put in interventions that will help in bringing down the cost of production at farm level across the board. Thirdly, back to investment. We cannot continue depending on Mother Nature day in, day out, year in, year out, when we know that there are other solutions that we can invest in. And here I bring the solution of irrigation. Now, irrigation, we don't have to do huge mega dams that will cost a lot of money, but we can have small water pans at community level that can help in bridging when there is a shortage, and these are investments that can be done at a relatively lower cost, and they can really mitigate. So the point I'm bringing in is that investment in the kind of right size of irrigation that is not so huge and is just at community level to make the production to supplement rainfall and so on and so forth. The third point, which is connected to the markets being remunerative, is that we have to get trade taking place. Because what we are facing, and we've seen it in Eastern Africa, most governments put in restrictions to trade. They put in bans, they put in import bans, export bans, they put in a lot of restrictions. And these restrictions only hurt the farmer. And they never even help the consumer at the end of the day. And therefore, what we're saying is that the whole issue of trade markets, integrating the market back to the farmlands, and starting from the market before you go to the farm. So as to say that by the time a farmer puts the seed on the soil, they need to be knowing or having an idea where will they sell to who and what would be the expected price through contracts, through arrangements, through relationships, through partnerships. And that really is an important thing that we must do deliberately so as to do that. But my final point in answering your question,
it won't be your final point, Gerald. That won't be your final point, because I'll come back to you, both of you, because this is quite an interesting one. Now we're talking about solutions. The off-takers, they need to be present. In fact, when we come back, we'll take a break. When we come back, we'll speak pretty much more about some of these solutions and also key in the issue of climate change and security. Stay with us. Tim Njagi and Gerald Masila, both gentlemen, are still with us here, trying to proffer solutions to the continent's impending food crisis. Before that break, Gerald was trying to give us, he called that his last point, and I said, no, wait a minute, that won't be your last point, we'll come back to you. But this time, let's go to you, Tim. You know, the solutions to the crisis before us, are very important. And some of the pains that some of these farmers go through has to do with knowledge about, their profession.
Yeah.
And that is why climate change is one issue we must also be talking about. As a researcher, how have you been able to, bring these points, these views, and these threats posed by climate change before farmers in your locality?
So thanks. So one of the things that we've done as a research institution, of course, we have now dedicated one of our key research themes on climate change and building resilience. As one of the key things is that the focus on resilience is because, one, the nature of the shocks tend to change from time to time, and then of course give the nature of the type of the farmers, the enterprises that farmers are involved in are more integrated. And the key thing is to see, because we understand that the way mankind has intervened in nature, it will be some time before we even start reversing the adverse effects of climate change. So we must ensure that we can be able to document how farmers are being affected, for us to be able to understand how we can actually help farmers. And then we must also try to see how we can, generate knowledge that can also help other farmers in other localities, especially in the things that work in terms of becoming resilient and adapting to the effects of climate change and weather variability. So beyond undertaking research, we also, interact with policymakers, again, just to make sure that the interventions and the policies that are being pursued are actually to the benefit of the farmers. And of course, more importantly, is that we also share the information from our findings to the farmers for them to be able to learn about what works for them, what also works for other farmers in different areas that are facing the same shocks as they are. And
how has the reception been so far when you speak to these farmers about climate change?
I think at the farmer level, one of the key things that has been exciting journey for us, of course, is that beyond even our solutions, we realize that farmers have their own indigenous knowledge of trying to cope with these shocks. And I think for research, that has been an interesting journey, because most of these would ordinarily not be documented. And I think there are a lot of, not just ourselves, but also civil society organizations that are now fully involved in trying to document the indigenous knowledge with different communities on how they adapt to different shocks. Then the other thing is that beyond that, there's what is beyond what the community can do. And that's why the policy now comes in place. For example, when you talk about investments in, drought-tolerant varieties, that would be beyond what a community can do, and that is now the role that the government plays a key role in trying to invest in research as a public good to be able to generate and deliver these varieties to communities. But we've seen that for communities, including changing some of their planting periods, or either planting early or planting late, being able to use indigenous knowledge to forecast when the weather is likely to start. I think those are important technologies that must be maintained within the communities and enhanced so that they can be more effective in helping communities adapt to the effects of climate change and weather variability.
Now, we're moving into the learning process proper. Let me bring in Gerald Masila. You're the executive director of the East African Grain Council. Tell us what we can learn from your council now that Africa is watching. Well, Gerald, I hope we can get back to you as soon as, I get that connection back to Gerald Masila, who is the Executive Director of the East African Grain Council. Okay, I understand you're back. Now? I wonder, now that the continent is watching, let us get some learning from the East African Grain Council. What is it about? What can we learn from your council?
Thank you very much for the question and for the opportunity. And this connects very well with the discussions we had. The first thing I would like to share from EAGC, from what we have learned in the interventions, in the work we do at EAGC, is that we need to fix the disconnect between agriculture as a profession and as a discipline and farming or a farmer being a subsistent, poverty-stricken kind of a fella who actually is not applying knowledge, is not applying science in the work that they are doing. So that kind of disconnect needs to be resolved. And to resolve that, we need to bring in serious management practice and management discipline in the whole space of agriculture, in the entire value chain of agriculture. And for us to do this, they say in management that if you can't measure it, you can't manage it. And so to measure, we need to have very, very clear data and sources of data and information so that we know data clearly on where are we able to produce what quantities can we produce, what storage capacities do we have, what is the marketing trend and consumption, and even be able to come up with what we call food balance sheets at country level, at regional level. And to do these food balance sheets, then you need to have good data in terms of data on production estimates. And here we are saying we can use technology like satellite imagery to be able to even look at the effect of locusts, the effect of armyworms, and even to estimate the produce, the crop as it's growing out in the field, and use these estimations to be able to project, to know what quantities we are expecting to have. And with this information, it will inform trade, it will inform policy, and we'll be able to have an opportunity to manage our agriculture processes well. One of the interventions we are doing at TAGC in the climate change space is that we are providing information on climate change, and we recently developed a new tool that we are calling Climate Information for Grain, CI4G. It's available through our various websites, www.eagc.org and also www.ratin.net. And in the CI4G process, we have partnered with various other experts in remote sensing, in climate information, and we are generating information for farmers at their locality. We're able to warn them.
In other words, sorry to cut you again. In other words,
when to expect rainfall, when to expect sunshine,
Gerald,
and give advisory on what we can do.
In other words,
so
listening
those
to
are
you,
some of the suggestions we are giving.
Absolutely. In other words, listening to you, I think it's safe to say the continent is not, in, need of, experts like yourselves and your institute. Now, this takes us to Tim Njagi, who is a research fellow, because, for instance, in Nigeria, Africa's biggest economy and its most populous nation, the president, Muhammadu Buhari, has promised to tackle food crisis and insecurity ravaging the northeast of the country. Now, Tim, now we have a twin problem of climate change and insecurity in some parts of Nigeria and some parts of the continent. How can the continent help farmers stay safe and the people stay well-fed and happy?
Security is a serious challenge, not just for farmers, but I think for all of us. And I think the situation in northern Nigeria would be somewhat similar to what we have in some northern parts of our country, where we have terrorist attacks from time to time. And the challenge of this is that it chases away investments. That one, nobody wants to go to those areas. People are fleeing those areas, and we've now seen that again in the northern horn of Africa, we are seeing instability again in northern Ethiopia, South Sudan. And this poses serious challenges, especially because that land cannot be utilized in those periods where people are fleeing or trying to make sure that you first of all secure your human life. I think what the government needs to do is to guarantee security for farmers. I think over Christmas we saw reports in northern Nigeria where Boko Haram had kidnapped rice farmers. I mean, those farmers would not go back to their lands unless security can actually be guaranteed. And if we have a way that we can deal with the insurgency, the extremism that is in pockets in some of these regions, then of course we can actually see people settling there and making investments in those lands. I wouldn't say I have a clear solution to that, but even in our regions, we've seen that in areas where there is high insecurity, we have populations in those areas almost full-time relying on food aid because nobody even goes to produce because of the threats that are there, and also because some of the investments that you would require, you have people who would invest in businesses to supply you, with seed, with inputs. People will not come, and that kind of constrains what you can do. And also, even whatever you're able to produce, you're not sure that you can safely keep it so that it is for your benefit, for you or your household. And what happens is that most people, again, we just produce little as a kind of both risk mitigation, because you also don't want to attract people to attack you because they don't have food. So we really need. We need to find a way where we can guarantee security in those areas. And then definitely, as we've seen for example, if in Southern Sudan, in the few periods where they were a bit stable, they had a new government coming in, and people going back to settle, people making use of that land, we can actually make significant progress in terms of improving our production in those areas and reducing the reliance on food aid. But yeah,
I was going to ask you something. And this goes to both of you. I think it was Gerald who mentioned locust and armyworms. The first time I saw, armyworms was in the late 80s in Nigeria, and I'm tempted to ask a question now. How do they pop up? You wake up and suddenly, boom, they're all over your farmland.
So,
you might want to help us with that, Dr. Tim.
Yeah. So I think part of the reason why we have the infestation of pests and diseases, again, one is security. I think, like in the case of the locust, the locust invasion that we had last year, most of it was blamed on the insecurity in the Middle East, because with the instability of the governments in those areas, there was no effective measure for their control, and that led to their multiplication and migration. In the case of armyworm, I think that has been blamed on poor regulation, because some of that is that seed came. There's reports that seed came. We received contaminated seed. There are reports that, of course, like in Kenya, the first time we had a huge burst, like 5 years ago, most of it was being reported as coming from the western part of Uganda. But mainly, what we know is that where we have, first of all, for pests, when we have security, and what security means is that when you have effective governments and governments that work in terms of monitoring and controlling those pests, then the risk of spread to other regions, it becomes small. Then the other issue is that we must ensure that for diseases, we like for the East African region, we have standards for seed trade. It's good that these standards were harmonized, but we know that there are gaps that sometimes allow contaminated materials to move in. So that requires stricter enforcement to ensure that even when they are noted, the host country is notified. that we are getting material that is contaminated from your area. But we know that in the region, one of the seed certifiers have been struggling because some of these keep changing rapidly. Absolutely. And you need also to, enhance the technology that you're using. You need to keep changing it and updating it to make sure that you're able to detect some of the emerging pests and diseases.
Vista, issues. A wide range of issues have just opened now to looking at the food crisis on the continent, gentlemen. Not the best of times in Africa, as lamentations persist over inadequate, availability of food. Children dying, the mothers crying. War is sending farmers out of their homes and away from their farms. Water and food have become very rare privileges, and lasting solutions have to be found, and in good time too. And that is why we're excited having both of you. Times have to be better for Africans, and we must do our part. So, gentlemen, as we wrap on Village Square, many thanks for joining us today on the show. Dr. Tim Njagi, Senior Fellow, Tegemeo Institute of Research and Policy at Egerton University in Kenya, and of course, Gerald Masila, Executive Director, Eastern Africa Grain Council. Thank you for being such nice company, both of you.
Thank you.
Well, don't forget to join us.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having us.
Thank you. On the go at youtube.com/News Central TV, and on Star Times, if you are in Nigeria, channel 274. You can get to watch us on the News Central app on Google Play and iOS. See you tomorrow. Bye-bye.